So one can wash the bowl, then one takes the piece of soap, and because there'll be oil and some grease on the hands, so then one will rub the piece of soap in the hand and then go back into the water of the bowl and rub it again. Okay, so now when the Buddha finishes washing his bowl, then he puts the bowl on the floor, neither too far away from him, nor too close to him. And it said he is neither careless of the bowl. Of course, the bowl, in those days, they could have been made often out of clay or metal, iron. So if one is careless, if it's a clay bowl, the bowl can break. If it's iron, if you're careless, it could get knocked on the floor and then it gets a dent in it. Nor is he over-solicitous about it so that he shows that there's a kind of attachment to the bowl. Okay, then when the Buddha finishes eating, he sits in silence for a while. I guess if it's what they call a Sangika dana, that's a dana offered to the Buddha together with a number of monks. The Buddha will wait until the other monks have finished their meal. And even after then, he'll wait a few minutes till people finish putting away the dishes, cleaning up a little, getting things tidy in the kitchen. They'll do the big cleanup after all the function is over. But just wait till everybody finishes, putting away their things. Then people will put mats down on the floor in front of the Buddha and sort of waiting till all the commotion of people coming in and saying, you sit here, you sit there. When all of that is over and everybody will be sitting sort of silently, waiting for the discourse to begin, then the Buddha gives, it's translated here as the blessing. It's called anumodana. But it's not just a blessing like, may you be happy, have long life, may you enjoy good health. Not just a blessing like that, but the Buddha will give a little discourse, not going into like really deep, mind-boggling teachings or really exact teachings on meditation, but just, it's called anumodana because it means literally rejoicing with the good deeds of the people who have offered the meal. So the Buddha will explain, for example, the merits of giving, how observing giving is beneficial both to the giver and the recipients. And then he'll speak about other issues relating to how to live a virtuous life within the household. Then he'll speak about the merits of giving. And then probably at the end he'll recite some verses expressing the appreciation, his own appreciation, the appreciation of the Sangha. And in those verses there might be lines like, the good man who gives to the virtuous ascetics with a pure heart, intent on cultivation, such a one acquires much merit that leads to happiness in many future lives. Well, we recite, the typical verse recited today is Bhavatu sabba mangalang rakantu sabba devata sabba buddhanubhavena sabba dhammanubhavena sabba sanganubhavena sada soti bhavantu te. Bhavatu sabba mangalang, may there be all good fortune. May the deities protect you by the spiritual power of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Sabba buddhanubhavena sada soti, may you always be safe. Okay, so now when the Buddha is giving the blessing, he doesn't criticize the meal and say, very poor people might be giving. He doesn't say, why are you giving just maybe rice and dal? Why aren't you giving a lot of other fancy dishes? But he's always appreciative, whatever he accepts, and he doesn't do so praising the meal if it's wealthy people giving a lot of sumptuous food. He doesn't say, oh, you gave such wonderful, delicious food. Please, when you invite us again, make sure you give this dish or that dish. But it says he instructs, urges, rouses, and gladdens the audience with a talk purely on the Dhamma. Okay, so then after giving the Anumodana, the blessing talk, then he rises and he departs. Nowadays, at the end of the Anumodana, people will, usually they make offerings of other necessities for the Sangha. Typical in Sri Lanka, we get like a package with, usually have a towel, a bar of soap, toothpaste, toothbrush, sometimes a package of tea, package of milk powder, package of sugar. Other things that on special occasions it might have an umbrella, or usually there'll be an offering to the eldest monk. They'll get they call it Atta Pirikara, the 8 requisites, the 3 robes, the belt, the filter for filtering water, the razor blade, or it's actually one of those straight razors, a barber's razor, a sewing needle. Okay, so now when the Buddha is walking, again, not too slow, not too fast, not like he wants to get away. That's my own fault. Okay, then it describes how he wears his robe, how he goes back to the monastery. Again, this repeats some of the earlier things. When he sits down in the monastery, he establishes mindfulness in front of him. This is interesting, the last one in this paragraph. He sits with his mind set on his own welfare, on the welfare of others, on the welfare of both, even on the welfare of the whole world. Okay, now the next paragraph describes how the Buddha teaches the Dharma. This is at the monastery. It could be like in the evening, early evening, when many people are coming to the monastery to hear the Buddha give a discourse. And so now he's actually doing formal teaching. It's not like just the blessing discourse, the blessing talk after the meal. Okay, so it said that he doesn't flatter the audience, and he doesn't berate them or criticize them. It's not like this, they call them fire and brimstone type of preachers. You are all sinners, you're all going to hell. When you fall into hell, the devils are going to grab you and burn you. Not like that. But he just speaks purely on the Dhamma to instruct, urge, inspire, encourage, and gladden the audience with a talk on the Dhamma. And then there are supposed to be 8 qualities of the speech of the Buddha that are described here. His speech is always distinct, intelligible, melodious. It said he has a melodious voice, audible. It has a ringing tone to it. It's euphonious, I guess a kind of resonant. That seems very similar to melodious. I don't know the distinction, actually. It's deep, a deep voice, and sonorous. And then it said that his voice extends as far as the audience, but it doesn't go out beyond the audience. That's what it says. And I've always wondered, as a practical matter, even when we have like a relatively small class here, for my voice to be heard in the back row, I have to use this electric microphone. In the days when they didn't have electricity, I imagine the Buddha would be speaking to groups of, several hundred people over a large area. I don't know how his voice extended that far. And even if we say that the Buddha might have had the spiritual power to project his voice, but say when ordinary monks were giving discourses, it could be several hundred people come, maybe even 1,000 people. In fact, in some of the descriptions of the famous discourses, it says that 1,000 people came. I wonder if any old Sri Lankan monks are alive from before the days when electricity was introduced into the monasteries. I could ask them about that. Yeah.
And I noticed people have called him a bodhisattva.
Yeah.
So would not his voice have carried across? First of all, let me say I'm feeling a lot of aversion to this sutta.
A lot of what?
If he's a bodhisattva in our living day, and this is a capacity of a mere arahant, then would not Venerable Ananda Maitreya's voice have carried forever? And does this not point to the non-literal nature of this sutta?
You mean because his voice is preserved in the form of recordings?
I'm wondering, did he ever speak to 1,000 people, and could they hear him? Did Venerable Ananda Maitreya speak to very large audiences without amplification, electrical amplification? So that should have been my first question.
I think when I saw him speak in public halls, he had the amplifier.
Did anyone ever have difficulty hearing him? And perhaps that's their own karma.
This I don't know because I didn't go through and ask everybody. But with electric amplification, the sound would have carried pretty, throughout the hall. I don't know, it's something. And the fact that somebody is having a bodhisattva aspiration doesn't mean that his voice is going to be amplified over long distances. I mean, the Dalai Lama is regarded as, a very advanced bodhisattva, but when he gives talks in public, it's with amplification. Yeah.
I'm guessing with proper architectural design, the voice will magnify. That help a lot.
Maybe so, yeah. But I would imagine that in the Buddha's time in India, they would give the talks outdoors. They would set up a kind of a platform, and probably the Buddha would go up on the platform to talk, but there would not be walls. Maybe sometimes there would be walls. If there's a preaching hall, a lecture hall, then he would preach but talk inside the lecture hall. But often, when it's pleasant weather outside on a full moon night. Anyway, this is a mystery that I haven't been able to solve yet. Okay, so his voice has all of those qualities. Okay, and then when the Buddha's finished his discourse and people rise from their seat and depart, looking only at him and concerned with nothing else. And there was another quality of the Buddha's discourse that I had read about someplace, and this is that when the Buddha is speaking even to a large audience, everybody in the audience somehow thinks that the Buddha is speaking directly to him, answering exactly that person's questions, dealing with that person's problems. But the Buddha is speaking, with everybody in mind. So it seems maybe the Buddha uses his ability to read the minds of others in order to touch on different problems of different people in the audience. Okay, so now the young Brahmin student is sort of summing up his report to his master. He says, "We have seen Master Gautama walking, sir. We have seen him standing. We have seen him entering into the house. We have seen him sitting in silence inside the house. We have seen him eating indoors. We have seen him sitting in silence after the meal. We have seen him giving the blessing or the short talk after the meal. We have seen him going back to the monastery. We have seen him sitting in the monastery. We have seen him teaching the Dhamma to an audience in the monastery. And so that is, he's saying, that's what I've observed of Master Gotama. Okay, so when this was said, then the Brahmin, Brahmayu, he must have been listening to this report, with very excited, maybe with his hair even standing on end, because the Brahmins, according to this discourse, they had the record of somebody who's going to become a Buddha, but they had never found anybody who measured up to that standard before. And now from this description of the Buddha as one who has the 32 marks and who behaves in such careful, mindful, dignified, self-possessed way, he realizes that somebody has appeared who's fulfilled all of the qualities, all the manifest qualities of a fully enlightened one. So then the Brahmin rearranges his robes in a respectful way, and then he extends his hands in the Anjali, that's the joined hands, in salutation towards the Buddha, and he exclaims 3 times, it's Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. So he recites that 3 times, and then he says, perhaps, or I think it's better to translate, I hope sometime or other I might meet this Master Gotama and have the opportunity for some conversation with him. Okay, maybe at this point I'll stop and then ask whether we have any questions, anything based on what I've covered so far, the 32 marks or the behavior of the Buddha. Okay, there's a mobile microphone. Let's pass that.
Thank you. I have 2 little questions and I guess a bigger question.
Okay. We'll take the little ones
first. 2 little
first.
questions. I was reading this and I realized, the Buddha had hair as opposed to Buddhist monks today. So I was wondering how, I guess in the Vinaya it's specified you don't have hair as a monk. So how did that work? And also, I've noticed always in the Buddha statues that the Buddha has very large ears and earlobes, but that doesn't seem to be one of the 32 marks.
Yeah.
So where did that come from?
Okay, so let's take those 2 questions. Okay, about the hair, it's the tradition within the Buddhist monasticism and also within even the pre-Buddhist ascetic traditions of India, or at least many of them, that when one leaves the household life, one shaves the hair and the beard, and then one goes forth. And then there's a Vinaya rule that one is supposed to shave the head within, I think it's 2 months or 2 fingers of growth, whichever comes first. So 2 fingers of growth, I think it's like 2 joints of the fingers. But it's traditional, very seldom do we see monks who wait that long to shave their head, because then one starts to lose the distinctive appearance of a monk. It becomes almost like, it starts to look almost like an ordinary person with somewhat shorter hair than normal. A little bit like maybe like Barbara, or a little bit like Barbara's hair. So usually in Sri Lanka, say monks will shave the head, could be every week, usually at most every 2 weeks. In the case of the Buddha, there's a report, it's post-canonical, it's not in the canonical text, but it's said that when the Buddha went forth, he shaved his head, then his hair grew back to a certain length, curling, the way described here, and then it didn't grow any longer, so he didn't have to shave the head in the future, but the hair always remained at that length. Whether this is legend or truth, I don't know. I mean, it's quite possible that the Buddha his hair did grow and that he shaved it, but for some reason he's depicted in statues with the hair like that. And it's described amongst the 32 marks that the hair turns to the right in these little curls. Okay, that's the shaving of the head. The large ears. There's, in addition to the 32 major marks, there appears in time a set of characteristics which are called the 80 minor characteristics. They appear in commentarial texts, not in the sutta texts. And probably the long ears will be found amongst those 80 minor characteristics. I've looked at them in the past, but I don't remember them. Okay, those are the two.
My other question is with respect to how literal are we supposed to take this information? Because it does, like you mentioned, seem a bit weird for a person to have these characteristics. I know that these characteristics predate Buddhism, right? And so I'm curious why the Buddha or Buddhism sort of chose to incorporate them into the Buddhist belief. And are we supposed to take these characteristics as something the Buddha really exhibited?
Really?
Exhibited? Like a really long tongue and these sort of things.
First of all, there's a little problem here, which I haven't been able to resolve. Okay, the text, the sutta text, and we find this in a number of suttas, speak about the Brahmins having a record of 32 marks in their sacred books. And yet, I've heard that in the Vedas and the other sacred books like the Brahmanas, there's nothing about the 32 marks. And so it seems strange that the Buddhist texts would speak about 32 marks, and these texts would be in existence at the same time that Brahmanism was flourishing. And so if somebody from the Brahmin clan comes to learn one of these suttas, which is saying that the Brahmin books speak about 32 marks of a great man, and if he's like a very learned Brahmin, he'll say, wait a minute, we don't have these 32 marks in our books. And then, how to explain that, I don't know. And then, as you said, the 32 marks are rather strange. But my thought would be, suppose the Brahmins did have some record of these 32 marks, then it might be the case that the 32 marks are, as I said early, something very, well, some things one could see are very subtle, but other marks are described so that they're not so subtle, like having arms that come down as long as right to the kneecaps. And those would be pretty long arms, and one would be immediately noticeable with arms that long. Katie?
On one hand, I'm wondering if you can respond to just what it is like to be a teacher. I mean, here today we have this, a lot of people, I look at the Buddhist teaching as usually very practical, and this sutta I find is very impractical, as it is.
Yeah, but I didn't quite finish with...
excuse me.
Yeah, I didn't quite finish with my answer to this question. Okay, supposing now that the Brahmins did have a record of these 32 marks, then one could assume that the Buddha might have had the ability to let's say, transform his appearance a little bit, or through a kind of psychic determination, mental determination, to make those marks more prominent, so that the Brahmins, when they're checking out the Buddha to see whether he has all of those 32 marks, they will notice those marks, even though non-Brahmins or even Brahmins who are not specialists in the text wouldn't see them as being, particularly prominent. That's just a hypothesis.
Because it seems to be a typical maneuver of the Buddha to take pre-Buddhist concepts and change them a bit into Buddhist concepts. I think even later in this sutta we see that where the Brahmin lists several characteristics and then the Buddha kind of redefines them for him.
Exactly. The Buddha.
That's what's happening with. But I'm wondering why he chose to take these perhaps pre-Buddhist marks and incorporate them, and why would he bother for that? Why would? Is it just a way to? Was it a way to kind of just convince people and get their confidence?
If, in fact, the Buddha displayed these 32 marks for the purpose of winning over the Brahmins, then that would be the explanation. Something I was going to say. Yeah, but anyway, if we take the text on its own word, it's not that the Buddha makes a determination to gain these 32 marks, but they're supposed to be considered marks of physical excellence, and so they arise as a result of the Buddha's virtuous deeds, virtuous behavior in his past lives. So they just, manifest spontaneously. And apparently they're considered, at that time, marks of excellence. Because it's either a Buddha has them, or one who has them is either a Buddha or a wheel-turning monarch. So it's not considered in any way physical deformations. Okay, Katie was going to say something first. Yeah.
Well, I was curious to know how you, as a teacher, a doctor of philosophy, a monk who's... Perhaps you didn't have this feeling when you first read this sutta of this is not going to be maybe the most practical sutta to give to Western audiences. But I'm curious if you had another sutta, how you struggle with, how you resolve to present something. To me, this is very hard to digest, even knowing that there's some supernatural things that one can experience in jhana or in their whatever previous supporting conditions might help someone experience that. And number two, I guess I was also looking at...
let me just take, the reason I took this sutta is really mainly, well actually some parts I think are very practical in this. I disagree. Maybe the 32 marks are not so practical, but the descriptions of the Buddha's behavior, even though many of them are sort of beyond our ability to imitate in all respects, but they do set up a kind of model of what I would call good behavior, sort of showing a balance between restraint, consideration for others, showing how to behave with dignity and self-possession in one's day-to-day life, not when having to go someplace, not walking in a hurry, not being a slowpoke, when sitting down, sitting down mindfully at the right distance from the chair, not dropping into the chair, when eating the food, not eating too quickly, not eating too slowly, chewing the food properly, swallowing each bite of food before you start taking the next bite. A lot of that is practical. But it's actually the second part of the sutta that we'll come to next week is the part that I really wanted to emphasize. Because we get a sort of explanation there of what it means to be an enlightened one.
So the second thing I had, and you presented the arising of these 32 marks as something that fits with dependent origination by saying his past acts would lead to these traits arising spontaneously. For myself, when I read this, I thought, this reminds me of something that conflicts with dependent origination, that there would be a base nature
Oh, what?
That there would be a fundamental permanent nature of 32 marks that would re-emerge, which doesn't fit with dependent origination philosophy. So, but just a few minutes ago you explained the way these 32 marks would arise within a dependent origination model.
Yeah.
For myself, when I read this, I thought this looks like something that conflicts with dependent origination, because it's saying that there's a permanent, as in not one of the seals of Buddhism, but there's a permanent nature of an enlightened one that will come with 32 characteristics, and those will just reemerge. So to me, it looked like something that was presenting, I agree, there's some very practical things in here, but it seemed to me very undermined by something impractical. And that it was actually that there were parts of it that could easily be seen as not as being in contradiction to dependent origination.
No, certainly not in contradiction to dependent origination. The fact that, suppose that all enlightened ones have these 32 marks.
Can you see how a person would think that, though, that 32 marks should just be a permanent basis within samsara, that 32 things would constantly exist and reemerge and reemerge?
Well, the 32 marks is just like a model or a diagram, you could say. But it's the 32 marks as they appear. Those are all impermanent, because anybody who has the 32 marks is going to pass away. And when that person passes away, the 32 marks that their body possesses will also pass away. Okay, Barbara she had her hand up first.
Yeah, I was going to say, we tend to hear this as something that the Buddha taught, and I don't see that in at least this part of the sutta, that this is people's perceptions.
Actually, that's a good point. That's a good
I
point.
mean, I know that I remember having experience once of seeing Thich Nhat Hanh talk, and when he walked into the hall, he was gold to me.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I wasn't looking for it, doesn't mean it was gold. But any of these, it's what people are perceiving. And the other thing that just occurred to me is that, I mean, I know these weren't all seen and heard by Ananda, but we've also got whoever put the sutta together.
Actually, that's a good...
As seeing or not seeing these as being important.
Yeah. That's a very important point. You see, this sutta doesn't take the form at this point of a discourse of the Buddha, but this is sort of reports that are coming down. And it's actually describing a conversation between a Brahmin and an aged Brahmin and his student, which could raise some interesting questions. How did the compilers of the discourses get to know about this conversation between the Brahmin student and his teacher? How to? Well, that's another question, but would seem it would raise my suspicion that how did they get to know about a conversation between the Brahmin student and his teacher? I doubt that Uttara or Brahmayu when they're meeting the Buddha, would call Ananda up and say, Ananda, this is the conversation that we had, a couple of 7 months earlier. 7 months ago, this is our conversation. And then Ananda would get that all by memory. So we could think that this is, at least this background to the Buddha's meeting with Brahmayu could be something which is composed. Okay, this gentleman here. Yeah, please.
Yes. I'm thinking that each of these 32 marks, might be taken as a physical attribute, that is to say, purely a physical description, or conversely, they might be taken as a description of a behavior. For example, when we say that an athlete, let's say a runner, has legs like an antelope, or we're not saying that he's got these peculiar weird legs.
Yeah.
We're suggesting that he has the grace of an antelope as he runs, and I think many of these marks can be interpreted that way.
Let's see.
So whether that's going a little bit too far with metaphor, I don't know. But
I think that certainly works with cases like with a fair number of them. of course, when it describes the Buddha as having legs like an antelope, that's pretty much what it means. That
Yeah.
I think that they're thin legs and kind of gracefully shaped.
Well,
Let's just see some of, when he says that he has the jaw of a lion, again it means a quite prominent jaw.
My friend and colleague to my left suggests the possibility that the description of the tongue might be a little far-fetched in this sense. But I'm seeing that also as a possible, I want to say metaphor for a want of a better word, for the ability to extend one's thoughts, to express oneself in a very profound way. I think there are ways to, I'm not sure, but as I said, I might be pushing this beyond the limit of our study, so to speak. There are descriptions that Dogen Zenji also brought forward in terms of tongues being supernaturally long.
Taking them literally or
Well, no,
metaphor?
I mean, I wouldn't take much of Dogen Zenji's descriptions literally, but I mean to say, in terms of mountains and valleys, I don't have the quotes or the chapters with me.
Traditions preceding Patanjali. So Patanjali
In what?
in the Vedic tradition preceding Patanjali. So Patanjali comes shortly after the Buddha, maybe 150 years. And the tongue, things like the Kachari Mudra, long tongue, the ability to stimulate a certain spot. But they had a tradition of clipping the under the.
Yeah.
So there, I don't know much about it, but I know Kachari Mudra has a tradition that probably goes back to the period of the Buddha. If we look at it from Patanjali's time, thinking how does this thing arrive within 100 to 200 years of the Buddha. So I don't know much about it, but the tongue has some, the ability to stimulate a spot on the upper roof of the mouth and then trigger the top of the head, this chakra. There's some basis.
Oh, I see, within the yoga tradition.
Yeah, and the pre-physical yoga tradition, the tongue.
Yeah, the tongue takes on becomes even more stressed even more within the Mahayana sutras. You see sometimes the Buddha sticks out his tongue, and then the tongue is supposed to spread till it covers the whole cosmos. And sometimes when he sticks out his tongue, then 6 colored rays of light are supposed to come out from the tongue and spread all over the universe.
Yeah, but that's hardly far-fetched in the sense, I mean, that seems hardly far-fetched in the sense that it suggests that the Buddha's words extend throughout all the 6 directions.
Yeah. But the description here seems to be intending it quite literally. Because it does say that the Buddha is able to extend his tongue so that it covers the nostrils and reaches to the 2 ears. Okay, there are some mysteries that we cannot solve. Any further questions or comments? Please, can you take the microphone?
Are there other examples in other texts where the Buddha can change his appearance physically?
There are suttas in which the Buddha does change his appearance in certain ways. In this sutta, he doesn't actually change his appearance. This was just my hypothesis in regard to the 32 marks, that the Buddha might be sort of able to emphasize certain of these characteristics so that the Brahmins will notice them. Yeah, but there's a rather peculiar sutta that occurs in Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Eights, and also in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the sutta about the Buddha's passing away, where it said that the Buddha describes or explains how he visits different types of living beings, and then it says that he presents himself like them and speaks in their kind of voice, in their kind of language, and he teaches them the Dhamma, and then he leaves, And then when he leaves, then these beings in the different realms, could be in the Deva realms, the different Deva realms, they're wondering, who was that? Was he one of us, or somebody who's coming from elsewhere? But it's not so common for the Buddha to change his appearance. Usually, he maintains the familiar appearance. Any further questions, comments? Okay, then we'll end now. We end with the sharing of the merits. And then we'll have discussion, come back for discussion, say about 10 after 12. So we could examine some of the 32 marks or the Buddha's behavior after lunch. Okay, so we now share the merits with the devas or deities, the bhutas, the nagas, wishing, and with all beings in the world, wishing them to be well and happy, and for all of their good purposes to be fulfilled. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang.